JJ, welcome. This is the very, very special. This is our last presentation for this year. In January, we're starting over again. We will have a publication coming out early next month that has copies of 12 of the major presentations we made in 2016. And our distinguished speaker today, JJ Green, will be one of those. The first presentation you made a few months ago, JJ. So you're back by demand of the students and the faculty and the staff. Sorry about that. It's always nice having you here, JJ. Well, let me just say, JJ just came back from a trip, and he's going to be talking about that trip and his attendance at a very significant conference. And some of the insights he had shared with me when you came back very briefly. I said, my goodness, that'd be interesting to our students. Although we weren't planning another presentation this year, we thought we were finished. That's why we were going to publication with our book. We said, this we want to share with our students because it's a very timely subject. It's a very important subject, and it's one that we study in our classrooms. We have some of our professors sitting in the back. Professors do a lot of work on these issues. Our professor, Sean Turner, has a department that focuses on national security communications. Professor Steve Meyer has a program that focuses on national security issues. This presentation today touches both in a significant way, national security and the whole question of communications and information and how you use information. So I think it's very timely. So the title is The Cold War Never Really Ended. And let me just say two words about JJ Green. I think you all know him. He's the National Security Correspondent at WTOP. He reports daily on international security, intelligence, foreign policy, terrorism, and cyber developments. He also provides regular on-air analysis, guidance, and global security matters. He covers everything. If you want someone who really knows it's whether it's terrorism, and looking at al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, ISIS, whether it's looking at what's happening in China and North Korea, that region, you're looking at crime, narcotics, Latin America, and so forth. This is a man who covers all the subjects. He joined WTOP and the family at WTOP on March 11, 2004, the same day of the Madrid bombing by al-Qaeda. In the years since, he's traveled extensively investigating, reporting, as he will be talking about today, and analyzing the U.S. war against terrorism, and has interviewed the leadership of all key national security components of the U.S. government and many security, and I emphasize this, many security and foreign government officials around the world. This is a diligent journalist who knows the subject so well and has great credibility. He hosts and I highly recommend this, he hosts the weekly program, The Hunt, which goes in depth, and I emphasize in depth, with experts on al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and emerging terror threats. He's traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, Central Asia, Europe, Africa, covering national security matters. Let me just end by saying JJ graduated magna cum laude from Hampton University. He's fluent in Spanish, speaks working level French and Korean, and is studying Arabic, and an avid athlete. He's an accomplished speed skater, regular runner, swimmer, cross trainer. And this is, you gotta be careful. If anyone falls asleep or dozes off, he's also an expert kickboxer. So be careful with your questions. You want to keep on the good side of him. JJ, we're honored to have you here today.
Thank you, Ambassador. The thing is, being an expert is one thing, but being a practicing kickboxer is another. So if you do fall asleep, there's not much I can do. I'm just hoping that you don't. But first of all, let me just say good afternoon. And thank you for coming, and all of you that are tuning in via the internet. I'd first like to thank Ambassador Joe Detrani for inviting me to come here today to speak as a part of the Distinguished Speaker Series here at the Daniel Morgan Academy. Their objective is to educate, train, and develop experts and leaders in the national security and intelligence communities, and they educate students to develop actionable solutions to address global and domestic security challenges. And I can tell you just from my engagement with them here at the Daniel Morgan Academy, they achieved that magnificently. I'm here because of my long and extremely productive working relationship with Ambassador Detrani. I met him personally about 10 years ago when he was mission manager for North Korea with the director of the National Intelligence Office, and I'm grateful for all that I learned from him as a working journalist and as a human being, because he's a tremendous human being too. The topic of my talk today is the Cold War never ended, Russia's quest for revenge in 2016. And I want to be clear about why I'm here. And that is, I'm here as a journalist who has been investigating, looking, searching, seeking, and collecting information about this particular topic for a very long time. And what I wanted to do, as Ambassador Detrani pointed out, was to tell you about some facts and some information that I collected and have collected recently, and began to realize that there was a pattern. So basically, I want to connect a few dots for you today. But first, I want to also say thanks to Professor Meyer and Professor Sean Turner in the back, whom is, I'd say, another exceptional individual that I've known for a while, who, if you're in his class, pay attention. If you're not in his class, still pay attention. Because here is an example of an individual who knows how to get it done through communication verbally and non-verbally. Here's an individual who has some great skills that can be used to teach. On to why I'm here. Russia made it very clear, and they've made it very clear since the fall of the USSR, that they would get revenge against the West and the U.S. for what it believed the U.S. and the West were responsible for happening. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said on several occasions, in his own words, the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 21st century was the breakup of the USSR. And gradually, since then, he set about rebuilding, trying to return Russia to the superpower status it was and the size it was during the Cold War. For many U.S. officials, they said numerous times, the Cold War is over. But for years, numerous signs have emerged in stark relief to me that suggest that this idea simply is not true. And this is based on my journalistic exploits in discussing with people, collecting information from sources, and talking to people. In the past decade, I've researched and investigated and written about and reported on radio about developments related to this enigma. Russia's development of cyber capabilities is key, as I lay out what I've learned today. A key development took place in October 2011, when the National Counterintelligence Executive, Robert Bear Bryant, issued a groundbreaking report that named the Russian government as a major perpetrator of cyber espionage. For diplomatic reasons, naming of Russia over the years preceding that announcement had not been done, again, for diplomatic purposes. But it was a true sign that the intelligence community saw something bad, really bad, on the horizon. And it was right. The report, titled Foreign Spies, Stealing U.S. Economic Secrets in Cyberspace, noted Russia's extensive, sophisticated operations motivated by Russia's high dependence on national resources, the need to diversify its economy, and the belief that the global economic system is tilted towards the U.S. and other Western nations at the expense of Russia. Moscow believed it needed to get going. Moscow's highly capable intelligence services, according to this report, used HUMET, cyber, and other operations to collect economic information and technology to support Russia's economic development and security. But now, in 2016, new evidence, new information has emerged indicating that Russia has expanded this into a very dangerous political plateau. And here's where it gets interesting. Russia's deployment of cyber and hybrid warfare tactics. As Ambassador Detrani mentioned, I was in Sofia, Bulgaria, in mid-November during a NATO conference. And NATO ACT, the Allied Command Transformation, was, I'm so grateful to them for inviting me to go there, because I was the first time they had a journalist there observing or participating in this particular event. And this particular event was one in which they were trying to advance their cause, recognizing a lot of what's taking place in their space is becoming more critical and different from what they dealt with in the past. So I was there at this conference. David Kilcullen, a lieutenant colonel in the Australian Military Reserve, former chief strategist in the Office of Coordinator of Counterterrorism for the U.S., and senior counterinsurgency advisor to General David Petraeus in Iraq in 2007 and in 2008. He laid out something that was pretty mind-blowing to me. The Russian government has been doing a series of secret operations for a number of years, and as a result, and this is my journalistic assessment, they may have a slight edge on the U.S. because they've been engaging in this. This is based on what I believe these individuals I was talking to were telling me. But I'll get to that in just a moment. But first, in 2008, Sergei Trechikov, a former top KGB, the former top KGB and SVR spy, later a defector to the U.S., told me during an interview, and he said this in his own words, these are Sergei's words, "More Russia has money, more aggressive Russia will be." And if you know Sergei, you can see he meant this, and he meant this deeply. He said, "First of all, I want to underline, I am not a Boy Scout. I am not an alarmist. I am not an analyst. But I know what the Russians are up to." Because he said, I, speaking about himself, was a part of that governmental team that developed those plans. He said, "I know what their plans are, and I know what the nature of today's Russian government is." He's speaking in 2008, but he was looking ahead because he knew what he was seeing. He saw the beginnings of what we're looking at now. He's no longer with us. He passed away in 2010, unfortunately. But I believe if he were here today, he would say, "See, I told you so." Sergei said, quote, "Russia will do everything it can to undermine American interest. What's happening in the Caucasus right now," this is a quote, he said, in Georgia, specifically in 2008, he said, "It's not against Georgia." He said, "Georgia's an important player, but not that important. The whole Russian escapade in Georgia is aimed against the U.S." These are Sergei Trechikov's words. He said, because the reason that this was done, he said, is because Georgia's the closest and probably the only real ally of the U.S. and NATO in the whole region of the Caucasus. And he said for that, Georgia was supposed to be punished. And he said, right now, I'm watching, and this is 2008, Russian TV on a regular basis. He said, "I am watching Mr. Lavrov," this is a quote, "Mr. Putin, and others that I worked with." And he said, "It's absolutely clear to me who was the real target of this action, and it's not Georgia, it was the U.S." And he said, if the U.S. were in a stronger position geopolitically, Russia would never, ever do what they did in Georgia. These are the words of Sergei Trechikov. And he said essentially that this was a scenario where Russia felt as though they started thinking they weren't punishable. They were above international law, or just above the rest of the world in terms of their skill and their interests. He says they don't care. He said they don't care about what the civilized world thinks of them. They're only interested in achieving what it is they want to achieve. He said, "I don't think the U.S. can do anything really to stop Russian aggression in Georgia or anywhere else in the world, and in the Russian neighborhood specifically." He said, why? Because this would mean a direct military confrontation with Russia. And he said, no one wants that, because it would be extremely dramatic and it could lead to a military conflict. What Sergei was also saying was that the Russian government and the military have some clever ways to reach their objectives. And he said they will use them to justify their goals. Example, the Georgian conflict, 2008. This brings me to David Kilcullen, which I told you I spoke to back in November. And this opened my eyes, and it helped me to connect the dot. This is about cyber as a tactic. 5 years ago, the NCIX warned that Russia was developing capabilities. Kilcullen said to me, in the days leading up to the Russian invasion of Georgia, there was a large-scale cyber attack on the Georgian government, on its web presence, DDoS attacks, coming from criminal groups, in part acting on behalf of the Russian government. Early in the operation against Georgia, 2 of the hackers got into the bank account information of the Russian government military, the account they used to pay for commercial satellite imagery. Some of you in the intelligence community probably already know this, but I did not, and I'm not sure how many average Americans know this either. They got into the bank account of the Russian military that was used, or the Georgian military, sorry, that was used to pay for commercial satellite imagery to support their air defenses. And on day 2 of that conflict in Georgia, they drained the money from that account. The next day, the Georgians didn't have any money to pay for satellite imagery. The air defense system went down. On day 4, the Georgians stopped the conflict. This was because of a Russian-sponsored cyber operation. And as you know, the Russian government attacked another neighbor, Ukraine, in 2014, using, again, another very unorthodox approach. This, again, is where some dot connection was necessary. And this harkens back to what Sergei Tretyakov said again. And I repeat, he said, Russia will do everything it can to undermine American interest. They used, again, a very unorthodox approach, tactic, hybrid warfare, little green men, masked soldiers in unmarked green army uniforms carrying modern Russian military weapons and equipment appeared during the Ukrainian crisis. After months of denial, on December 17th of 2015, Russian President Vladimir Putin confirmed the presence of Russian people, quote, in Ukraine who were engaged in, quote, certain tactics. He said, including the military sphere. But he added, this did not mean the presence of regular army. What it meant was, it was the Spetsnaz. Spetsnaz are Russian special forces, military units, which, you know, as you know, in Russian culture, perhaps maybe you don't know, in Russian culture, that is one of the most elite elements of their military. The Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO, General Philip Breedlove, said these little green men were, in fact, Russian troops. This, by the way, was not an innovation. Unorthodox, but it wasn't an innovation. It was a copycat move. It was a page out of Nikita Khrushchev's book from Berlin, 1961, Checkpoint Charlie. He ordered the removal of all of the markings from all the tanks and the military personnel uniforms that were in place as that long confrontation in Germany and the Cold War that we knew began. The tactic was a part of a strategy, connecting the dots again, that Kilcullen says was something the West and the U.S. certainly need to pay attention to. Irregular warfare, he said. In fact, he says Russia has built a whole new strategy about warfare. And according to Kilcullen, instead of using kinetic military might as the engine to drive its projection of power, it's elevated information warfare to the pinnacle. That's his principal approach. He says cyber, hybrid warfare, and kinetic tactics are simply an element of the information warfare strategy. Why did this happen? Lessons learned in Iraq was what was told to me by a top former U.S. intelligence operative about a week ago. He said what the U.S. did in Iraq in 1991 did 2 things. It stunned Iraqi forces because in 1991, looking at a little bit of research, Iraq had the #1 military in the world in size of force proportion to population. It was number 4 when it came to defense spending per capita, number 6 when it came to total military on active duty rank. So what happened from August 2nd of 1990 to 17 January 1991 left militaries around the world stunned at how quickly and completely the U.S. invasion U.S.-led coalition, should I say, responded to and put down Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. But on the flip side, the second thing this whole element did was it was a blueprint. It was, according to Kilcullen and this U.S. Counterintelligence official that I spoke to, former, I should say, it laid out a roadmap for the U.S.'s state-based adversaries. He said what happened in Iraq showed them that the U.S.'s adversaries should not try to match bombs and bullets with the U.S., but instead they should set about redefining how to go to war with the U.S. This former counterintelligence operative said, what happened was, in the midst of its collapse, Russia realized it had nothing that could help it, at that point, deal with a head-to-head confrontation with the U.S. It couldn't match power with the U.S., so it needed something else. It needed a new approach. So by the early 2000s, under Vladimir Putin, Russia began what it viewed as a resurgence by employing a new war strategy that the West may have underestimated. Russia began to redefine its view of war, and according to this counterintelligence former counterintelligence operative, it adopted new concepts for confronting its adversaries. The bottom line is that the U.S., he said, needs to understand and embrace the fact that war, as far as Russia's concerned, is no longer what it used to be. It's changed, and it's not just a kinetic tool. A kinetic tool, kinetics is just a tool in the larger toolbox. It's not the leader, it's not the driver, and he said the West shouldn't think of that anymore as a primary Russian tool. There are some that say the 2016 presidential election was an attempted Russian coup. That is absurd on the face of it. But when you look deeply at what's going on, and based on the information that I've gathered from several sources that I've spoken to, they've said this whole scenario involving Russia's involvement in the election was not to choose one candidate over the other, but to influence the process, sow chaos in the process. And a part of this has to do with the nuclear winter scenario many years ago, and I won't go into that today because the U.S. used some very ingenious tactics to undermine Russian objectives back then. So basically, what according to these sources is going on is the Russians have decided to try to flip the script a bit and use a very, very unique plan of action to engage the U.S. political system. And this chaos that they're sowing may not be, in many cases, we may not know what the results of it are for a long time. But it appears they have been planning. As Sergei said in 2008 in the interview, years ago, an operation to influence the election and foment discord in the U.S. began. So what do we know about this operation? Well, one thing we know, it's called Operation Pawn Storm. It's an ongoing cyber campaign that's pretty far-reaching and very ambitious. And it's been known to primarily target military, embassy, defense contractor personnel from the U.S. and its allies, including government institutions like NATO, opposing factions, dissidents of the Russian government, international media, and high-profile political personalities in other countries, including the Ukraine and other countries that Russia does not consider friendly at this point. Some of Operation Pawn's most impressive or notable activities include the 2014 compromise of Polish websites. In December 2014, corporate accounts of 55 employees of a large U.S. newspaper, their accounts were hacked, essentially. And it started with phishing. The FBI has been warning about this for a long time. The FBI and the National Counterintelligence and Security Center have been warning about this. 2015, they targeted 3 popular YouTube bloggers with a Gmail phishing attack. February 2015, using malicious iOS apps for espionage, it also attacked the NATO liaison in Ukraine with fake OWA pages, and that is Outlook web access pages. So it's a very sophisticated operation that they've been engaging in, not the least of which was, according to these sources that I've spoken to, a key tool when it came to figuring out how to access, steal, and then proliferate emails that came from the Democratic National Committee. Additionally, more recently, 17 U.S. government intelligence agencies assessed with a high degree of confidence that the Russian government was behind the theft of emails and documents from the Democratic National Committee. Other sources suggest the Russian-sponsored hacker programs have begun a similar process targeting the incoming administration. And I have not seen any evidence of this. I've talked to a lot of people. Nobody has anything that they feel comfortable talking about or sharing, but they suggest that there is something taking place. Because knowing what they know about the leadership of the Russian government and what they know about Russia's motivation and what Russia feels still is a very strong revenge or very strong feelings of revenge against the U.S. for the Cold War. They feel that this is just a matter of time before that activity, again, a part of this umbrella information warfare strategy will emerge. See, Russia, according to these sources that I've spoken to, does not feel that it has the gunpowder or the bullet power to match the U.S., but it can do some other things, and it can do it by surprise, they're hoping. So David Kilcullen and other U.S. Western intelligence officials say there are some very important things that we should be looking at this point. Post-election distraction, number one. They say it's meant to buy Russia time to take action in Syria and other areas, other neighborhood areas of Russia, i.e. Eastern Europe and other countries there. I'll give you a good example. David Kilcullen pointed out during a briefing at this NATO conference. You may not have heard of this, or you may have. There's something called migration manipulation that he believes the Russian government and others seem to have information suggesting the Russian government has been heavily involved in. A good example is Kirkenes, is a small town in Norway on the border with Russia. Nickel is the Russian town on the other side of the border. Kirkenes in Norway has a policy that you cannot cross the border on foot. So, lo and behold, during the height of the migration in the last few months, they discovered in Kirkenes thousands of children's bicycles in this town, which arguably may have a population of 1,500, meaning you're not going to have anywhere near that number of children in that town. So what turned out, according to Kilcullen and some other sources that I've spoken to about this, someone provided bicycles for these migrants to cross the border into Kirkenes. They came through Nickel. So he has a thought about where these bicycles came from. And without saying with any certainty, because obviously there isn't any proof at this point, that it was something that was sponsored by a Russian government-connected organization. A couple of other places this has taken place as well in the region, in Finland. Same thing. A couple of other places, the same tactic has taken place. Migration manipulation. It's one of the tools that, according to these sources again, is being used to further the objectives of the Russian government. The element that we're looking at here is plausible deniability. If no one can say for sure that the Russian government did it, that leaves the open question, who did it? And then it also leaves the question open as to why it was done. Kilcullen had a theory on that as well. He said he believes it's being done. All of these situations, meddling in the politics of Bulgaria, meddling in the politics of Moldova, meddling in the politics of the U.S., migration, manipulation. It's all done to overwhelm the bandwidth of these nations to respond to certain elements of Russian aggression. That's not a bullet or a bomb. It's not kinetic. It's different. Information is what it is. Or it's some kind of unusual scenario where they simply, that country that's affected simply does not have what it needs. It hasn't studied, it hasn't practiced, it hasn't perfected what's necessary to push back this kind of aggression. And according to Kilcullen and others, it is indeed aggression. So this is what's been taking place in this post-election period in Russia. And as they try to buy time, Kilcullen believes what they hope they can do is to engage in some other places while the U.S. is focused on this situation, coming together and, embracing the new government and essentially getting focused on what it needs to do. He says we should be looking very carefully at Venezuela. Russia is losing Cuba. And it needs a place where it can project its power in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela is extremely weak, extremely economically depressed, and very anti-U.S. at the moment. And according to several sources and a number of staunchly anti-U.S. countries have active military forces in Venezuela, including North Korea. They have special operations forces in Venezuela at this point. Kilcullen pointed this out to say very simply and very clearly, Russia's not playing the game that it used to play. And we, the U.S., he said, needs to take a different look, a different approach at what's taking place and do some dot connection. But as again, overwhelming an adversary with chaos or scenarios will distract them. Distraction and deception operations are nothing new when it comes to Russia, but this may be a new version of one. And thirdly, I would say, and lastly, there is a connection, according to these sources that I've spoken to, between where Edward Snowden ended up after leaking U.S. documents and information, the leaking of the DNC documents and emails by WikiLeaks and Russia's activities. Before the WikiLeaks dump of documents and emails related to the DNC, several news organizations reported that someone who called himself Guccifer 2.0, who investigators now believe was an agent of the Russian GRU, the Russian intelligence service, was an individual who got a hold of these documents. So there's quite a bit of activity going on that seems to have a very anti-US and anti-West theme to it. But the difficulty is placing absolute blame on Russia or anyone for it. According to Tretyakov, according to Kilcullen, according to the counterintelligence source that I've been talking to, and numerous others in European countries that I've been talking to, this is a part of the strategy to make it such that they cannot be blamed, but publicly, that is. But those who know intelligence know it's the Russians. They send calling cards all the time. Situations back during the summer or earlier this year where U.S. diplomats were attacked overseas. In one particular case, an individual's arm was broken, and a calling card was left. It was very clear to the folks in the intelligence community who did it. Apartments ransacked, essentially breaking and entering secretly. And it is all about sending messages to the U.S. and to the West. So to sum up, what I've discovered is not earth-shattering. It's a development by degree. that Russia has been involved in for a long time. And it seems to me, based on the information that I've gathered from talking to these folks, that this is a part of something that the Russians started years ago. It's not a new thing. And we, as a country, need to pay very close attention to it. Again, what I have been talking about today are the observations that I've made from conversations and from reporting and from research dating back a good long time, but certainly more importantly, some revelations and understanding about what's taken place in the last year as far as Russia's view of the U.S. goes, as far as Russia's plans for the U.S. goes, and the challenges that lay ahead for the U.S. And so as I wrap up today, I will say this: change is necessary for the survival of every individual, culture, nation, and organization. Technology undoubtedly has created both positive avenues for that change and nefarious consequences as well. The increasing speed of world events driven by technological advances in communications has ushered in an era of unprecedented economic competition, political instability, security concerns, population migration, and human transformation. Events that took long periods of time in the past can now happen in mere seconds, triggering catastrophic outcomes. Thus, the need to prepare for tomorrow today is the key theme that's emerged from all of the discussions and conversations and engagements that I've had with all of the sources that I've spoken to about this. I didn't bring any documents, I didn't bring any slides, I didn't bring anything with me because I wanted not to distract you from what this key point is that I wanted to make to you today. A growing list of top-notch U.S. intelligence officials all agree. Russia is involved in something that's designed to hurt the U.S. one way or another. When it happens, how it happens, where it happens, can happen. Well, it's not etched in stone. They're doing it in a way in which they can leave it loose. They're doing it in a way in which they can activate certain elements of it, use the elements that work for them, and discard those that don't. But I will say this, looking at Syria, what's taking place in Aleppo now, looking at Venezuela, what's taking place in Venezuela now, looking at what took place in Moldova, what's happened in Lithuania, what's happened in Bulgaria, what's happened in Ukraine and Georgia, there is irrefutable evidence that the Russian government is up to something. The key is figuring it out and deciding what to do, on what terms, and when. So thank you for not falling asleep, because that way I didn't have to prove that I am really out of practice when it comes to kickboxing, but thank you.